I'm going to start with the words that President Obama expressed when he announced that he was signing DACA. And he said, these are young people who study in our schools, they play in our neighborhoods, they're friends with our kids, they pledge allegiance to our flag. They are Americans in their heart, in their minds, in every single way but one, on paper. And so this narrative of assimilation in this, this way that they've adopted everything, and that's what makes them worthy, right? When DACA was rescinded, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions used similar kind of language, though with a very different purpose. He says this administration has made great progress in the last few months toward establishing a lawful and constitutional immigration system. This will enable our country to more effectively teach new immigrants about our systems of government and assimilate them to the cultural understandings that support it, right? And so under this administration, the idea is that immigrants are not assimilating enough, right? And that was the reason for ending this program. This concept of assimilation is really prevalent, not just in political discourse and social discourse, but also in our research. And if you go back and look through even, the early work that was developed to look at immigrants in the US, it's always been about assimilation. Lately, we've been using immigrant integration a little more, though the ways that we measure it haven't changed all that much. And so we hear, really mostly it's been about measuring what are people's income, what is their occupational attainment, educational attainment, and specifically college completion. And basically in all of these measures, how much are you getting closer to the average of whites in the country, right? And so including with intermarriage with whites as one of the ways that we measure that. And so in some ways, it's about this parity with whites, about whiteness. And as a sociologist, this was all that I had been exposed to. And more recently, as I've been looking outside of the field, you're really thinking about deservingness, about this trope of you are welcome in this country if you're willing to do the hard work of assimilating, and then you are deserving. And you do it by achieving these things that we say are valid and are useful, but also in the process, it's about erasing indigenous and Black populations and the histories of the government towards them throughout the history of this country. And so now I'm really thinking, so is it assimilation, or how can we think about this through settler colonialism? And in looking at this growing field, there's a lot about deservingness that really gets at a way of maintaining settler colonialism as it is, right? Who gets to determine who is deserving, right? Based on what logics. And to follow the logics of assimilation, then immigrants are expected to want to attain this liberal inclusion that is really mostly just in name and not so much as getting to a point of liberation where people really are free to be who they are and to live as they want. And so if we look at it from this perspective, assimilation then is really only going to continue to reproduce inequalities that have been made valid through settler colonialism. And these are just some of the people that I'm reading and engaging with about some of this work. So imagine that, I had only ever been exposed to these assimilation frameworks, and then I'm trying to understand in my work, how do immigrants make a home here? How do we avoid, thinking about assimilation? Because I don't think most people necessarily are trying to attain it, especially under these terms. And when you see what's going on with the immigration regime, it's just really hard to fit that onto people's day-to-day lives. And I want to show you just a piece of this clip. And I'll warn you that it's a news clip of a child who witnessed his father being detained by the police. So it's kind of emotional.
On Monday morning, when me and my sisters were going to school, my dad was outside, and when I was gonna go with him to open the car, these guys came and they got him and they arrested him. They arrested him, and I was trying to say goodbye to my dad, but they got me, and when I was trying to say goodbye, they pushed me in, and I fell on the ground, and
¿qué es el mensaje que quieres mandar? Puedes decir un poquito en español. ¿Cuál es el mensaje? ¿Qué es lo que estás pidiendo el día de hoy?
que yo quiero mi papá atrás y yo no lo quiero en la cárcel.
¿Cómo es tu papá?
Un buen hombre, trabaja bien y trabaja en construcción.
So I shared that with you because this is a reality that people have been living for a while now, right? And when I see things like this, I just find this assimilation framework to be useless, right? How does any of that make sense in trying to understand the realities of people who are dealing with immigration policies so directly, and at the same time to see this child, this Guatemalan family, trying to use the language of deservingness, where he's forced to say, my father's a good person, he works hard, he works in construction, basically he's a productive member, and so we should be seen as humans, right? Is also painful to watch. And so in all of that context, I've been doing work with undocumented immigrants and with immigrants more broadly since 2001, and I've seen things that I would not have expected given where things were when I first started. And so in 2001, this is an excerpt from an interview with someone who at the time was probably about 16 years old, who I call Elizabeth. And she was a really popular and also just very confident young woman. And the only time that she suddenly kind of, showed any kind of physical reaction that showed any kind of shame was when she had to talk about her status. And she said, well, I feel ashamed. I debated so many times whether to tell my counselor, because you're just scared to tell somebody because you don't know what they're going to think, and you're just so scared of that reaction because you do feel inferior to somebody because you don't have the same rights as they do. You feel inferior because you know they have more rights than you. And so this was the common kind of narrative that I was hearing from a lot of the students, even though they were, stellar students, fit in all these other ways. When it came to this, there was so much shame in it. So fast forward to 2010, and there's this vibrant immigrant rights movement being led by some of the very same people or people like them years later who are now saying they're undocumented and unafraid and claiming this very openly around the country. By 2015, that group has really expanded to include other issues as well, not just what initially was about education, but to think about health, to make sure that they're being inclusive. At a very recent march, maybe like 2 weeks ago on my campus, the most common chant was undocumented and unafraid, queer, trans, and unashamed. So the expanded version of all of this has come years later, but it's come, right? And given where people were, again, the framework of assimilation just doesn't fit for me. And so I've tried to understand in studying Latino undocumented immigrants, where does all of this come from, the way that structures work to shape their lives, but also, first to point out that immigration laws have so much to do with how they're living their lives, which was something that we didn't discuss very much in the assimilation literature before, but then also how people understand those laws and what do they do with that understanding. some of the concepts that have been useful for me in the law and society literature, they talk about legal consciousness, this idea that the laws exist and you interact with them and they help you to understand things, and it's this dialectical process where you go back and forth, and ultimately you come and see things as natural and normal, but really the laws have determined them that way and shaped your understanding of everything from how you are in the world to who you are in the world. So it very powerfully shapes behavior, whether people mobilize laws in their favor or mobilize to work against laws. And in the case of undocumented immigrants, really shape their identities because the law is so powerful in their lives. To give you a little bit of context, immigration laws in the US are tricky to understand. They're complex. All immigration lawyers I've ever spoken with will say that it's such a difficult part of the law to work with because there's so much to know and it's constantly changing. And so there's that end of it, whereas on other sides, lawmakers, policymakers, enforcers of the law try to present it as, you know, one thing or the other. It's you either did this or you didn't. And so they emphasize these instrumental purposes of law, but in that process, they get to decide who gets detained, who gets deported, and those decisions, there's nothing that you can follow a formula for. It can turn out completely different depending on where you are, who you're dealing with. There's so many ways that immigration law can play out differently, even in very, very similar situations. So it's difficult to explain to people. And because there's this emphasis on the instrumental part of it, politicians can use it to talk about really harmful things, right? So not in the past election, but before it, the presidential election before it, all the Republicans were saying that their approach to immigration was going to be attrition through enforcement. And what that meant was that we don't have the funds to actually go and find and deport every single undocumented immigrant. So instead of doing that, what we're gonna do is we're going to basically make life hell for people. We're gonna pass all of these laws, make it illegal for people to rent apartments to undocumented immigrants, make it illegal for people to be able to pay for their water bills if they're undocumented, things like this that happened in different states. And then life will be so terrible that they're just gonna get up and leave on their own. And so because we have this language of law, it's so easy to make it sound so objective and that we can propose this as policy when we know that really we're trying to make life hell for human beings. More recently, you know, we hear about this wall, and everyone kind of understands that it means something more, but because you can hide behind the language of law and the kind of language of this country as a country of laws, you can create these things that really mean so much more than just the words that are being used. To make matters especially tricky for immigrants, immigration laws are practiced inconsistently. And they're multi-pronged. So even though we have federal immigration laws, states can do their own thing in a lot of ways. And even within states, you have different counties or you have different cities that can decide that they're a sanctuary city, or that they're going to make sure that their sheriffs get deputized as immigration authorities. You know, things can vary from one county to the next. And so when immigrants hear that they're safe here or it's so hard to know, because at all these different levels, things could play out very differently. And then you have immigration laws interacting with other laws. So you have laws that protect workers, you have laws that protect students, you have laws that protect renters in different states that still protect you even if federally you don't have permission to be here. So it gets really messy very quickly. People are getting most of their information from mass media. And so mass media doesn't always explain all of this, right? They're also kind of like, it's black and white, and you're either this or that, and this is how it's gonna play out. And so what those representations on mass media are also very powerfully shape this experience. So we have now a field in which people are arguing, we're producing this condition of illegality. If you just watch the news, if you just, listen to politicians, you might think that there's something about being undocumented that is inherent to people, and yet that's clearly not the case. What it means to be undocumented is something that shifts across time in different spaces for different groups of people. If you're young, if you're older, if you came as a child, if you came as an adult, if you're a man or a woman, however you identify in terms of all of these different things mean that your experience of being undocumented will differ from someone else's. But the way that things are right now, the condition of being undocumented has cumulative and far-reaching effects. So this area of like illegality studies is really to go against what a lot of just mainstream and actually anti-immigrant folks, at most marches you'll see people holding this sign, what part of illegal don't you understand? And again, right, it's not that there's anything inherent in immigrants, but rather that socially, politically, legally, we produce the conditions that create what it means to be in this category. And right now, a lot of what it means is that people are able to be deported and that they're vulnerable and that there's an extended period of uncertainty because our laws have not allowed for any kind of mass legalization program in a long time now. So in the 21st century, this what illegality is has a lot to do with criminalization. So we've taken groups of people who in the past, if we could apply any laws to them, it would be not criminal laws, right? It would be administrative laws. But because of the changes that have been happening over the last several years, there's a heightened policing. There's these programs like Secure Communities that at the federal level provided funds to train local police officers to act as immigration authorities. So that means that people who in the past are just driving their kids to school, or driving to work, going fishing, didn't have to worry about coming into contact with immigration authorities. But now it's much more likely for that to be the case because they can stop you for a broken tail light and then use that to check up on your immigration status. So a lot more people than in most other periods historically are detained and deported. So we have record numbers of deportations under Obama, how he earned his deporter-in-chief name that people give him. And under the current president, we're not yet at the levels of deportation, but the approach is that there is no kind of hierarchy of who is targeted most, so everyone is a target. So in terms of the legal consciousness stuff, in my research, legal consciousness is fluid and it's based on what's happening around you and who you are. And so at the moment when I've done these studies, for those who are first generation, those who migrate as adults, their legal consciousness of being an undocumented immigrant is often that based in fear because they know the process to get here. They came as adults and they know what it's going to be like if they are deported and try to come back. And so it's a real fear. Whereas for people who came as children, they didn't make the decision. They don't often remember the experience of migrating. They don't know what it would mean to be sent. And they've grown up going to schools here. They have very similar lives, like Obama said in his quote. So for them, it's more about stigma, right? At the moment when I've been doing these studies, it's been about stigma. And so when you think about what that means for their well-being, they're going to be affected differently. Part of what I care about in my work is then how do we overcome this to form a broader immigrant rights movement, right? And so for those who are stigmatized, if you can remove the stigma, it's much more likely that they're gonna get involved and claim their rights. And whereas, dealing with the fear is a bigger and different issue. So in California, just to give you some context about how the legal consciousness there has been changing, Assembly Bill 540, which is the in-state tuition bill, was passed pretty early on in 2001 compared to other states, many of whom don't have in-state tuition bills. And what that means, just so you can get a sense, right, is that you're either counted as an international student, even if you've grown up in that state, and you have to pay anywhere from like 7 to 12 times more for tuition, making it prohibitive that you can't go to college, right? So having in-state tuition makes college more accessible for a lot more people. So that's been the case in California since 2001, and immediately we saw more students enrolling, especially in community college. But what was really interesting about it is that it created this label. I showed you the quote of the young woman, right? The shame was her thing, and there was no way she would ever claim or say undocumented out loud. And so in that moment, when this passed, it created this label of AB 540 that people felt much more comfortable using. So they called themselves AB 540 students, and they would go up to their counselors and to admissions officers at colleges and to the financial aid office and say, I'm an AB 540 student and I need help with this or that. Whereas before, as you saw from her case, she didn't even want to tell her teachers or counselor. And what happened on campuses then is that those people who wanted to be supportive then also used the label AB 540. And you saw these stickers people placed on their doors. You could go to campuses throughout California and see. And so it was this kind of code that others didn't understand. You don't normally know the bills at your state, right? But AB 540 was something that those students and their allies would understand. So it allowed for people to realize that there was this bigger community at a moment when they weren't yet willing to say out loud that they were undocumented. So by the mid-2000s, there's this growing awareness, right, that there's this collective problem. They're beginning to take risks in exposing themselves, building a movement. At this point, it was mostly about education, wanting to pass the DREAM Act, wanting for that population of students to have better access to be able to legalize their status especially. So in California, it was AB 540 students doing this work. And then as the DREAM Act nationally was introduced and reintroduced, that also created a label as the Dreamers that we're still hearing today, though many people in the movement prefer not to use the term anymore. But those labels then begin to help them shed the stigma as they're able to share their stories, hear others who have had very similar experiences. There's this recognition that it's not their fault, that they haven't done anything wrong, that they shouldn't feel this way, right? And they empower each other through that. And so nationally, we start to see various organizations taking lots more risks. A lot of these mock graduations are held, and increasingly more civil disobedience happens. From 2010 and on, we see a lot more kind of questioning of even the frames that are being used within the movement. So you have a group of people who are college educated, who have studied social movements, who have a mastery of social media and technology, and have gone through this process of overcoming stigma and able to understand that they need to make claims to make all of this change, right? So you start to see just on different campuses, because they're students, they have access, and so they're able to make this a national movement in different ways, but through campuses was definitely one of them. And they try to be very thoughtful about who they're including, making sure that there aren't the kind of exclusions that lots of social movements are known to have had. And after initially only focusing on the youth, there is a very intentional move to include parents as well, to include the generations that are not the ones who got to go to school here, to include those folks who don't don't fulfill the requirements for the dreamer narrative that was initially so prominent. We start to see much more civil disobedience from 2010 and on, people taking over legislators' offices and getting arrested. There's an escalation of tactics in some parts of the movement that are about just really resisting everything that's being claimed, right? So when they were claiming that only quote unquote criminals were being detained, they infiltrated the detention centers to interview folks and find out why they're there, how they're being treated, right? They also, initially a group of 9 crossed the border and then came back to the border to apply for asylum, to push the line there and show how almost random these immigration policies are. And so these sorts of tactics bring greater visibility and at the same time are expanding the conversation and wanting to make sure that it's not just the youth who are being included in this. And so people start, from the same movement, start asking, you know, secure communities, it's really criminalizing our entire community. That's something we need to get rid of. Here, I still don't know how they did it, but they got up on one of the detention centers and threw a banner saying, "We're with you, don't lose hope," you know, trying to really be more inclusive of other sectors of the immigrant community. Again, same thing in other ways, making sure that queer, trans, that women, that different sectors of the movement feel that they are a part of this. And so, you know, thinking about all of this, about the ways that people started with so much stigma and fear, and to see how vibrant this movement has become, despite the ongoing immigration regime that targets their communities. The research questions that I'm playing around with, that I'm not even sure these are the right ones yet. As I mentioned, it's a work in progress, but how do these undocumented immigrant activists conceive of home, just as a way of thinking about this outside of the assimilation framework, and then using the settler colonialism framework, how are activists subverting traditional notions of assimilation? And this is, you know, very contingent in this historical moment, right? I don't know that this is always the case, but I'm drawing specifically on a project that I've been doing with DACA recipients. And so just in case you're not familiar, DACA has now been rescinded since September, but it's kind of phasing out as people run out of their permit. That was a 2-year permit that allows them to work or to access a driver's license in most states. And at its height, there were almost 800,000 people who benefited from it. And these are all people who are undocumented, who came as children, who went to school here in the US. So my project has been based on interviewing DACA recipients and 2 of their relatives to try and understand how immigration policies have played out for them. In my sample, I have both activists and non-activists to try to understand what the activism does for them and how it's helped them to understand those changes. And it's really fascinating. I'm happy to answer questions about all of that. But this is all in LA with some of the largest Latino immigrant communities there. So in terms of, you know, if we were to take that integration, assimilation framework, DACA certainly has led to higher wages for folks, but most now feel that they have to support their families because they're making so much more money. So it's not that they're overall doing so much better, but they're able to help their families. Some of them who are college graduates have been able to work in their fields, but not everyone has. And depending on how long they've been out of school, that, you know, doesn't automatically mean that they get to move up professionally. The people that I spoke with were mostly not married yet. So in terms of intermarriage, we don't know that, but certainly people express the feeling that they're not part of mainstream US society. And I'll start with a quote that I got with permission from an LA-based activist named Edna. And in right at the beginning of September, we knew that the decision was going to come down, right? And there was all this like nervous energy. People are really scared. What is this going to mean for them? They didn't know what it was going to look like. And so she put this out there kind of before the announcement was made, but we knew it was coming soon. And she said, 16 years ago, I migrated to America, the KKK at 12 from my beloved Guerrero. I settled in South Central LA, my home ever since. I learned English, still learning it to be honest, forever ESL, and a proud LAUSD graduate. South Central has a lot to do with the person I am today. She says, from early on, I learned about police harassment, overcrowded, underfunded schools, privilege, colorism, racism, anti-blackness, and how full of BS the whole pull yourself up by your own bootstraps expectation is, as it undermines, excludes, marginalizes, criminalizes, and invisibilizes anyone that doesn't fit this perfect mold if you don't abide by the rules and prove that you're good enough to get a slimy piece of this shitty pie. South Central helped me see how this fucked up society sees black folks as less than for being black, whether US citizens or not. This is part of my experience as an undocumented immigrant with intersectional identities. So she basically, put it all out there, right? The expectation is that you want me to love this country and only then can I be considered worthy enough to get any kind of legal status here. But the reality is that where I've grown up, even if I had it, you're not gonna treat me well, so I'm not trying to be a part of that. And that's kind of the sentiment that so many people have come to develop because of the realities that they live in day to day. So activism, Edna, like a lot of the people that I've interviewed, the activism really helps them to come to understand these things, and in the process, again, doesn't fit into this assimilationist perspective. This is someone I call Flor, and she's talking about what activism has meant for her. She said they showed us how much like a family they were, the group that she organized with. How comfortable they were with each other, how they didn't care if they were undocumented, if they were citizens, lesbians, gay. They just saw each other as like a family. It felt like it was my second home. So this notion of like home, this is how we're building something here that means something to us when we know that the country is rejecting us otherwise. And there's lots of great things that come as a result of that. So there's this sense of community. This person I named Martin here says it, being active, he says, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like there's a sense of some community and sharing of stories and a lot of like, I get you. There's always that feeling I get working for something that you believe in and working for something that is bigger than you. I love it. There's this like, again, if we think about the logics of settler colonialism, the individuality, the kind of like deservingness, the way that they're framing what they're doing is about going against that and instead looking for ways to help community, to be in community, ways to create home, and to not define who they are based on those logics of education and money and these things, right? A lot of this, and this is something I want to explore further, like I said, is contingent on this historical moment and being able to communicate across different groups that are organizing for different things. And so there's a lot of collaboration at key moments with Black Lives Matter, with the water protectors, wanting to understand, right, how do we make connections even if our struggles are slightly different? How do we understand that larger system and together fight against it? The one that stands out the most to many of them, because a lot of the activists identify as queer, has to do with understanding that experience. So here, Eric says, I think I've learned also to be very open about things. There's always different vocabulary that you're learning, and especially from youth, because now I work with youth who are so knowledgeable around LGBTQ issues and identities that we learn from them too. And I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed are very careful about their language, about how to be most inclusive, all through working in these spaces and making sure that they allow people's different identities to not be silenced there. There's also just actual concrete benefits of being in the movement in this ways. Here Ingrid talks about, she says, I know if anything were to happen to me, I can call Carlos and he can start an END campaign. So END is education, not deportation, what they initially called these campaigns, to be able to make phone calls to ICE, to have actions, essentially a campaign around an individual being able to stay in the United States. And that's at a time when people are being deported in massive numbers every day, thousands. And for a collective to be able to do that just for one individual takes a lot of effort. But I know that with the organizing that I've done in the community that I've worked for, I know that they would do that for me. And a lot of people don't have that privilege to be able to say, I'm connected to a community and there's this level of protection. So that, the fact that you also have these concrete benefits that you get from participating in this, and because they've seen it over and over, they see it and they participate in it when it's someone that they know and they expect the same, they're building their own kind of sense of community to fight against the vulnerability that they have. There's other concrete benefits from this too that have to do with leadership development. So Sabrina says, I used to be a quiet person and now I see myself leading groups. Speaking for that first time I came out of the shadows was horrible, but now I have improved so much in being able to inform the community and talking to undocumented students that are in high school and telling them my story and even motivating them to continue high school. I'm proud of the work I've done. A lot of students, because of where they are and who they are, would not have been considered leaders or good students, or would not have been taken on to mentor by, traditional schooling, contexts. And yet in this movement, the leaders have been great about encouraging younger folks to come and practice. And before you know it, you're leading the workshops and you do that with the next group. And they're the ones who have to mobilize when there's a change in the law, when there's anything that requires informing communities. So they have to, as part of being there, develop these skills that are also useful in various aspects of their lives. So that helps them understand that they don't have to rely on the traditional institutions of society to be able to do something meaningful in their lives. And they see changes, right? Lots of them actually made changes on their campuses. Susana says, we've definitely made an impact on our campus. We were able to bring an AB 540 scholarship. We were able to bring ethnic studies courses on campus, have various cultural events, awareness issues for undocumented students. We were able to have a coming out of the shadows. So they see the concrete results of the work that they're doing, and that gives it even more meaning. That way, because they get to actually shape what they are dealing with around them. So that kind of ownership of community helps them also see a future in this country. Here, Fabiola says, honestly, before I didn't really care about anything until I started becoming involved. Now I'm like, this isn't humane, people, are you kidding me? And she says, professionally, I see myself doing a lot of paralegal work for the community. I don't think that's something I ever want to stop working with, the community. So they're learning about things that they didn't know were options, that they never were told were options in their educational institutions, but through this process, understand that they can be useful. And to be a paralegal, she didn't have to do much extra training, and she knew it was having an impact in her community, and that gave her life meaning. So just to bring it back, we're going to continue to hear assimilation as the goal, especially under this administration, but really all, right? That's been the goal for immigrants all along the history of this country, that you're supposed to integrate, you're supposed to follow the logics of this, settler colonialism and uphold them to be considered worthy of being here. And for me, it's exciting to see that there are groups of people who are questioning that, even as they're demanding to be included, not following that logic. So just to conclude, right, the different ways that they're subverting those logics have to do with defining home in a different way and defining community differently, being able to recognize that they can be a part of a community without having to follow these expectations of what would make them worthy, what would make them kind of productive citizens. This sense of building something that's bigger than them, and that they recognize the greater good that they're able to play a part in makes a huge difference. And then this collective lens, right, is so different than that individualist approach of what we normally see under an assimilation framework. It isn't about what one person is able to achieve, whether that person went to school, has a good job, makes a lot of money, but about their community. And they're speaking about this in very similar ways, even across lots of different organizations. The people that I spoke to, LA is huge, so I spoke to people in different counties, and that vision, that collective vision, was really prevalent in all of their narratives. So, like I said, it's in progress. These are the things I'm thinking about. I would love to hear any ideas that you have. If you want to, you think I should be incorporating something else, or what this brings up for you. Does it make sense to you? Anything, I'd appreciate comments. Thank you.